Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning?
Welcome to another episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Efe.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're honored to welcome Professor Björn Krondorfer, someone whose work has helped bridge historical pain and political division through deep dialogue. Professor Björn Krondorfer, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Björn Krondorfer is the endowed professor of religious studies and a director of Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University. He holds a PhD in comparative religion from Temple University and studied Protestant theology in Frankfurt and Göttingen. Professor Krondorfer is internationally known for his pioneering work on post-Holocaust reconciliation, historical trauma, and dialogue among Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians. His work brings descendants of Holocaust victims and perpetrators into conversation and expands those conversations to include Palestinian narratives as well. His books include Unsettling Empathy, Working with Groups in Conflict, Reconciliation in Global Context, and The Holocaust and Masculinities. He doesn't just study dialogue, he facilitates it in the real world through workshops, field encounters, and critical pedagogy. Thank you so much for taking your time and having us today. We'll proceed with the questions.
Excellent.
What led you to work with descendants of both Holocaust perpetrators and survivors, and later with Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians? Was there a particular moment or turning point that drew you into this path?
That is a good question, and we could spend the whole hour on this path, so I will make it very short.
Yes.
Also, just in case you think I'd say something that you don't understand, either because of the language or because of the terms I use, just interrupt and I can clarify.
Right, thank you.
Okay. I want to be as understood as possible by anyone who's listening. Again, thank you for inviting me and for doing this. Why did I start this work? I would say the biggest decision, actually not decision, the biggest moment that changed it was my 1-year exchange at an American university in Philadelphia when I was 24 years old. I had no intention to stay in the United States, but I'm still here 45 years later. And during this time in a interreligious studies program about Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, I met people from all religions and got in contact with the Jewish community, and then very quickly with survivors from the Holocaust who came from different countries, from Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, wherever, and made it to the United States. And they kind of took me in as a German with an open mind and an open heart, and I began to really understand how we are all implicated, even if we were not born at the time, and how little we know. That got me in the trajectory of working with myself and with the Jewish community, and later with other students to help them understand these issues. And much later, in 2009, I was approached to help facilitate conversations that included Palestinians, Israelis, and Germans in this triangular setting, about which we'll probably speak later again. And that really helped me to understand the current situation, the current issues, not something that's in the past, but that is ongoing. And I really differentiate between to think about conflicts in groups that have ended and conflicts that are ongoing, because it's very different. Because in one case, there is an end, at least to the conflict itself, maybe not to the trauma, but to the conflict. And in ongoing conflicts, you don't know the end. And we clearly see this being played out right now.
You were a pioneer in confronting anti-Semitic legacies in academia, especially within theology, which has historically played a central role in shaping anti-Semitic thoughts. Could you share an early moment when you realized this work was essential? What resistance or challenge did you face?
Since I assume neither both of you nor your audience is necessarily interested in the scholarly world in the academic details, I can tell you that part of my own coming to terms with who I am as a German in an American and then in American context and working with Jewish people, I also had to face my own study of Protestant theology that I started in Frankfurt and Göttingen, as you mentioned, and learning how religions themselves, even though they always want to do good, have lots of prejudices and blinders about who they are and who the other is. And lots in the Christian tradition kind of is based on Jewish traditions, but then they kind of tweak it and distort it and turn it into something else. And so for me to learn the roots of Christianity and how Christianity changed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, what Judaism is about was really helpful as an academic study. And then I traced it particularly in some writings in Germany by German theologians at the time, from the 1930s, 1940s, and post-war. It was really, really important. I mean, it's so important. I can only encourage everyone, including both of you, to reach out and be challenged by people from different religions and different cultures, and presume they have no bad intentions, but that you can actually learn from each other.
Your decades-long work is grounded in deep understanding of legacies and trauma. Could you help us define and distinguish the terms intergenerational, transgenerational, and historical trauma? And if possible, could you share a brief story or examples that illustrate how these different forms of trauma show up across generations?
Yes, so these terms seem all very similar, and yet they are different. But I also should say that in the academic scholarly literature, there is no consensus on how to use these terms. But what I find helpful for my work and for people working in similar areas is to distinguish between intergenerational and transgenerational. Transgenerational means a trauma happened in your family, and your descendants, like the children and grandchildren, are part of this trauma and need to figure out how this trauma affected not only your parents and grandparents, but may affect you. It means it runs in your own family. That is transgenerational, from generation to generation directly. Intergenerational is broader. Intergenerational is like every generation who grows up in a society that was in serious conflict or in war or suffering or injustices, that even people who were not directly affected will still have to deal with their past. So young Germans today in schools, whether they are Germans from German families or Germans from families who migrated to Germany, they are confronted with the Holocaust one way or the other. Not because it runs in their families, but because it's something that people need to come to terms with as you live in Germany. And that I call intergenerational, because it's not directly your family, but you're part of a culture that needs to deal with this. That's the difference between these two. And historical trauma simply is a term that says that trauma can run through long-term histories. And it's important because in the medical field, trauma is defined very, very differently. Medical trauma is you getting an injury. Someone hits you on your head, then you have a head trauma. That's a medical term. It's just you having an injury. Historical trauma means it can go through generations. It might not be you directly affected, but it's a history that continues to influence the present times and might influence you as a person who had nothing to do with it, with your personal experience. I hope that makes sense.
Yes. Yes. You also use the term cultural trauma. What does this mean? And could you share an example that help us understand why this perspective is essential, especially in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Yet again, a term that you will find conflicting definitions in the literature if you ever want to get there and read it. the way it makes sense to me and what I take out of the discussions is that cultural trauma refers to the fact that something that we call a trauma is not naturally and organically a trauma. But it means that a society or community kind of over time agrees on a particular moment in their history as a traumatic history. So cultural trauma means a culture somehow comes to terms with something that happened and suddenly begins to call it trauma. So in terms of Israel-Palestine, when I started working with some Palestinians in 2009 and later, the term trauma was very much not known in the Palestinian community, at least with the people I worked with. It was new to them. And they felt, trauma is not the right term for us. We think about resistance. We think about sumud, steadfastness. We think about something else. But trauma is not how we would define our experience. It was not how they thought about it. And that significantly changed over the last 10, 15 years, that more and more in the Palestinian communities have embraced the expulsion of Palestinians from different places with the creation of Israel in 1948 and after. They defined this moment as trauma, even though 15 years ago that would have not been something they would have used in that sense. So that is what cultural trauma means, like defining an experience, say, oh, this is actually a traumatic experience, as opposed to, oh, it's just bad luck or an injustice, but it's something more than that. That's what the term refers to.
When people from historically conflicting groups meet, you emphasize the importance of recognizing historical wounds and power dynamics, and of naming the positions we speak from. Can you share a story or an example that shows how this kind of awareness has changed the way dialogue unfolds?
Now I need an hour. So when we talk about historical wounds and power dynamics and positions we speak from, I just want to let you know that when the kind of work we do, we meet in very dynamic circles. So I will try to give an example. When I started working with Jewish American students, university students, and German non-Jewish students, and we did 4-week programs where we met for 4 weeks and traveled to Poland, Germany, United States. And the same would be true for Israelis and Palestinians. I'm just using that example right now. And people come together and think, oh, ultimately, we probably all want the same and think the same and feel the same. And then in conversations, we realize that despite of our generation that feels the same, has the same music tastes or whatever it is, we actually very much differ on our assessment of who we are in this world, who we are to each other, and who we are in relationship to our history. And we are not aware of this until we get together with people from a different culture or different background. And they tell us, well, do you make an assumption here? And that is not at all true. Here's my reality. And my reality is very different from yours. And my reality, my understanding of the world, and my understanding of my intergenerational or transgenerational trauma is very different from yours. And what you're saying right now is actually either hurtful or offensive, or I simply don't understand it. And it is at this moment that you realize that the positions we are talking from are predetermined by our families, by our societies, by our education, and cannot be the same as people who come from a different background. And that is the hard work in these kind of dialogues, to begin to understand that with our good intentions, we have very different assessments, and we need to learn how to really address this as open-minded as we can and understand our own limits, and that our understanding of truth may not be the understanding of truth of the other person. And that is definitely true for Israel-Palestine these days, but it's true for many other conflicts. It's not limited to this one for sure.
You have worked closely with groups that include descendants of Holocaust victims, survivors, and perpetrators. What is one powerful insight or lesson that has stayed with you from these encounters?
We often think that a conflict ends when it officially comes to an end. So you could say the attempted annihilation of European Jews ended in 1945 when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Germany lost the war. And that, of course, is historically a correct statement. But of course, people who survived, the children that they have later and the grandchildren, they all still live about and through these experiences before 1945. So 1945 may bring an end to something, but it can continue for generations after. And so when descendants of Jewish survivors and descendants of German families who were compromised, who were guilty in some way during Nazi Germany, meet, they encounter these intense emotional differences. For many Germans, young Germans in the 1980s, 1990s until 2000s, it may have changed now, encounters with their Jewish counterparts of the same age always triggered intense guilt feelings. And they never knew how careful they have to be to say what they want to say. And for the American Jewish or Jewish students, it was more like, how am I betraying my family's history if I become friends with young Germans? You know, my grandparents or my parents suffered from Nazi Germany. They have nothing good to say about Germans. They didn't even want me to go to this exchange with German students, non-Jewish German students. And I don't know whether is it okay to like them? And so we have all these conflicts, these interpersonal conflicts in the interaction when we try to figure out the history, the traumatic histories that we come from, and the injustices that we experienced.
How did your work with the German-Israeli-Palestinian triangle begin, and what did that work actually look like on the ground?
It began in 2009 when a group working in Palestine and Israel asked me to consider facilitating a group encounter. My first reaction was, that is not possible. This is not a good idea. Israelis and Palestinians need to figure it out for themselves. Don't bring Germans in. But I thought I'd give it a try. And it turns out that it was amazingly productive, simply because it created not a dyadic relationship. Dyadic means two groups speaking to each other, and then they're kind of stuck between them. If you bring another group in, this moves all the time. So I give you a few examples. For many Palestinians, they see Israelis being in power over them, in power determining much of their lives or some of their lives. And they could never fully understand how their Israeli Jewish counterparts would have suffered from the Holocaust, where they had absolutely no power and were just victims of the Nazi ideology. But the moment the Palestinians saw suddenly their Jewish Israeli counterparts interacting with the Germans, and we had Germans who were in their 70s, meaning they were born in the 1940s during the Nazi regime, and young people at the same time. And when they suddenly saw that the conversation between Israeli Jews and Germans completely shifted the emotional sense of power and powerlessness, was absolutely eye-opening, because they suddenly saw the Jewish Israelis as in the position of being victimized, of being powerless in relationship to Germans, historically. And they've never seen this before in the interaction with Israelis. And so that was a change for them. Or when Palestinians and German participants suddenly felt that they agree politically on certain things. And then the Israelis were watching that interaction between Palestinians and Israelis. Suddenly, the Israelis got very nervous about this political tie between Germans and Palestinians on political issues. So that shifted things. Or third version, Israelis and Palestinians suddenly get along and realize that they have much more in common than with Europeans, like Germans. Suddenly the Germans felt like, why are we even here? I mean, they're just fine. They can't figure this out by themselves. We don't have to be here. These are just three examples of this constantly shifting power dynamics in a triangular situation. It's not stable. In the dialogue with two groups, you get often in a conflict very quickly, and then you don't know where to go. In a triangle, it moves all the time. And this doesn't happen in 2 hours. I should probably mention that many of these workshops last from 3 to 5 days. So people are committed to sit for 3 to 5 days. In a 2-hour workshop, nothing will happen.
What are some experiences or insights from the triangle work that stand out to you?
I think when people have been seriously harmed in their own lives or know stories from the families who have been seriously harmed, if you are able to bring this to a group where you have a triangle, the hope is that people are willing to listen to these stories of harm and the various feelings that emerge. So what you learn in these groups is to somehow figure out how to hold several truths at the same time. I think it would be wrong to assume that we can solve a national political conflict by determining who has the truth and who doesn't have the truth. That could relate to Israel and Palestine right now. That could relate to many other conflicts in Africa and elsewhere. That people think like, once we agree on the truth, then we can solve the conflict. I think the issue is that we need to hold several truths simultaneously. That your truth may not be my truth, but can we agree on, say, living together anyway, even though we may have different truths based on the experiences. And since we're talking about trauma, about the traumatic experiences that have been coming down to us through our families, that is the trans part, the transgenerational, or coming through our cultures and communities, the intergenerational part. I think there are different truths, and in these groups that is called Unsettling Empathy, you learn how to hold on to different truths and not be immediately defensive. That is one thing that you learn. The second thing is, and you may not know this, but there are many groups who simply work with the idea that if we tell each other stories, that is all that is needed. So Efe, you tell me your story, I tell you my story, and then I heard your story, you heard my story, and that's it. My work pretty much begins afterwards. Like, you tell a story, I tell a story. Now let's say I tell you something about my German family, and you need to be allowed to respond to it, rather than just say, like, I heard your story, great. No, you'd like, if you got angry when you were listening to me, you need to be able to say that, and say why. Because this might be related to the way I told it, or maybe to an experience that you had that you need to work through. And of course, then I can have the ability to respond to your anger and say, like, well, you misunderstood it or whatever. But it is really in the moment that we interact with the stories we tell each other that we can actually begin to get to the point that I call holding on to different truths at the same time. If we don't allow our responses to emerge, it means very little in my book, in my work.
You've developed the concept of unsettling empathy through your work in conflict settings. What does this concept mean, and how do these two worlds, unsettling and empathy, relate to one another in this approach?
Empathy in general means our ability to feel and understand what another person is going through. I was like, Yusuf, you tell me something and it seems foreign to me, but I have actually the ability to get the hurt or the harm that you felt and take it on. And for a moment, I can really understand what it was like for you. That is empathy in general, the ability to understand you completely, even if it is not my experience. Many people say, that is just appropriating your things. You don't fully understand it. And yeah, I don't fully understand it because I lived a different life. But I may, for a moment, completely understand the emotional impact of something that you tell me. It's not mine, but I may fully understand it. That's the ability of empathy. And for human life, it is absolutely essential for us to be able to do so. Actually, many people say it's part of our nature, and we can learn to unlearn it, or we can learn to improve it. And I think we can learn empathy better. That's generally empathy. Unsettling empathy is more of a challenge. Unsettling empathy is not only that I understand what you just told me, but that what you told me unsettles, disturbs my assumption about who you are, my assumptions about who I am, my assumptions about how I understand the world or politics or truth or emotions. Meaning your story suddenly unsettles all of my assumptions about the encounter we're just having, my assumptions about who I am in this world, who I am as a German after 1945, who I am in relationship to Israelis, who I am in relationship to Palestinians, and so on and so forth. I lose ground. And in that moment, we can actually have a real conversation. That is what called unsettling empathy means. It unsettles your own assumptions about how you think the world is functioning, what you think truth is, what you think reality is, what you think justice is. And suddenly you realize, Yusuf has a completely different world. And that world challenges my assumptions. Doesn't mean I have to change my assumptions, but I need to agree that there might be different assumptions and different truths out in the world that may not fit my own understanding. And at that moment, I may fully see who you are. Doesn't mean I'm taking over your life. It just means I fully see who you are, and you may fully see who I am. And if that happens, it feels amazing in these encounters.
Do we need to learn how to hold conflicting truths at the same time? And if so, what helps people develop that capacity?
I think that is the ethical and moral part of this work with unsettling empathy, that we learn that our truth is not the only truth. There are other truths out there, and they might be all true to some degree. At the same time, when we say that I understand fully who you are, and perhaps you begin to understand fully who I am, and that means holding conflicting truth at the same time, we still need to remind ourselves that borders actually exist, differences actually exist, and yet we are able and willing to cross these borders and able and willing to accept these differences. I'm trying to think of an example. Let me try to use the example of the wall that separates Israel and Palestinian territory. Israelis and Palestinians see the wall very, very different. One sees it as a prison, one side sees it via prison, another side sees it as it's our protection. These are two conflicting truths. And of course, both on the Israeli and Palestinian sides, people have different opinions about it. It's not like only one version of this. And if you meet in these kind of settings, we could get to the point to work with the physical aspects of the border and how that affects our lives. I give you one example. We met near Bethlehem in the Palestinian territory, and with Jewish Israelis and Palestinians and Germans. And one evening, one Palestinian from Bethlehem invited a Israeli woman of roughly the same age. He said, "Come with me, I show you Bethlehem at night." And we go to the wall, and you can see the wall from the side of the Palestinians, which looks very different because it's all with graffiti and paintings. And so they were venturing out at night, and this was to see the wall, which is so much an expression of the conflict there. And on the way down, the Palestinian spoke on Arabic on the phone with friends, and he wanted friends to join their meeting and meet this Israeli woman, Jewish woman. And the Israeli Jewish woman felt like, oh my God, we're going to see the wall. That is so important. But he's speaking to friends in Arabic. I have no idea what he's talking about. Maybe he's planning my kidnapping. That was her fear at that moment, despite having been together for 3 days. That was the fear that came up, the true feeling that came up in her. And of course, none of that happened to his friends were wonderful and they had a good time and they came back late at night after midnight and all went well. The important part is not that this happened, and the important part is not that she had this fear. The important part is that the next morning she shared that fear to the whole group in the presence of the Palestinian who took her to Bethlehem and see the wall. And that was a moment of truthfulness because that gave the Palestinian person to realize what this person went through that he invited with it didn't even occur to him that speaking in Arabic on the phone might frighten her. It wasn't because it was not in intention. So there was one experience with two different realities and they clashed and there was fear and anxiety involved. The important part is we were able to bring it to the group and work through those fears and then the shame. The Jewish Israeli woman afterwards felt ashamed. I mean, she was courageous enough to say, I was afraid. But then she felt ashamed of being afraid, given that this person was the person she worked with for the last 3 days. And so the fears and anxieties and prejudices all can come through this small little amounts of interaction. And if we don't pay attention to them, then we lost our opportunity to work with the emotional borders in the face of the actual borders that exist. In the case, the border that divides Israel and Palestine that they wanted to see in Bethlehem.
There is often silence and silencing around Palestinian trauma in Germany, a danger the Israeli psychologist Dan Bar-On warned about, calling the untold story the greatest risk of trauma transmission. Why is it so important, especially for educators, that all stories are heard?
I was so happy to see Dan Bar-On's name in your list of questions because I met him personally before he died too young on brain cancer, and I'm actually in contact with his daughter right now in this world. So he was really an important person. You may or may not know he is of Jewish German descent and went to Israel and became a psychologist and really wanted to understand the German psychology of those who became perpetrators, and wrote books about that. And then later went back to Israel, to Beersheba, and to be a social psychologist at the university there. And there he worked really very much with Palestinians and Israelis, and thinking like, whatever I learned about Germany, about German perpetrators and how they persecuted Jews in Germany, including his own family, to see how that becomes fruitful in the encounter between Palestinians and Israelis. So he's very sensitive to what is not said and what is said, the untold stories. The example I just used of the woman who told the story, she could have not told the story about, I was afraid I get kidnapped. She could have kept it to herself. That would have been an untold story. And there would have been this underneath all of our conversation, there would have been this strange, ambivalent feeling like, I felt something else, but I don't really want to tell my Palestinian friend that is what I felt. I'm afraid of you. And she did. And this moment the untold story was told, we were able to move on. And I think that is what Dan Bar-On ultimately is referring to, something like this on a cultural and societal level. And I think it would be good for Germany to really give space to all the stories that need to be told in relationship to people living in Germany, but also to their own relationship to what is happening in the Middle East. It's going to be a longer process. I don't think it's happening overnight and tomorrow. I do think that educators have a role in this because they can model how students in their classes can become active participants in telling their stories. That doesn't just turn into a shouting match or into anger. but into an attempt to help people understand where they come from, and that all of our perspectives are limited to who we are. They're not invalid, but they may not be the only perspectives that need to be heard. I think a classroom where perspectives can be shared and teachers are able to facilitate this without their own prejudices would be amazing.
Former German President Joachim Gauck recently expressed deep sorrow over the crisis in Gaza, saying he never expected such behavior from the Israeli government, from a country he held in such high regard. Could this difficulty in seeing the full humanity of others or shared potential for good and harm be another form of dehumanization rooted in unresolved anti-Semitic legacies?
Now you're asking a complicated questions. Germany, because of the Holocaust, Germany is highly sensitive to how Germans in public and in private talk about Jews and Judaism as a religion, Jews as a people, and Israel as a nation state that represents Jewish people, or at least in the past has become to represent Jewish people. It could have been much more broadly conceived. So there's definitely a fear among politicians to quickly criticize Israel as a nation state. I'm thinking of Israel as a nation state. To criticize Israel as a nation state because of the Nazi legacies of first demeaning, then misrepresenting, and eventually deporting, and eventually killing, with the intent to kill all European Jews at the time. So I think these legacies continue. I mean, we talked about traumatic, intergenerational historical traumas. I mean, this is one of the traumas that is unresolved and shows up in public discourse. It's not a resolved trauma in public discourse, and we see it played out right now.
Former Chancellor Angela Merkel described Germany's relationship and responsibility for Israel as a matter of Staatsräson. Should this responsibility be understood not only bilaterally, but as a part of a triangular relationship that includes Palestinians?
If we move to this place, I think it would be helpful. I don't see this happening anytime soon, but I think it is a possibility to when we say Israel, we say at the same time Palestinian people. So the Staatsräson really refers to the Jewish tradition and the Jewish people, which makes perfect sense after the Holocaust. But we are also now in a political state where the triangular relationships between Germans, Palestinians, and Jewish people kind of have come to a boiling point. And if it could be expanded to think about that Germany is responsible not only for the Jewish people, but to some extent responsible also for the Palestinian people, I think would be a way to move forward.
When you enter a group where you're not just a distant observer, but personally implicated in the history of the conflict, what mindset or inner stance do you believe is most important to hold?
As hard as that is to learn that what a person says with which you don't agree, to not take this personally. But to hold a space for someone else's experience and assessment of the situation, having some truth. Not every opinion is truthful. I mean, there are definitely lots of misinformation, but to when there is a level of honesty where we share with each other of where we come from and what we think and how we assess the situation, to assume there's truthfulness and goodwill on each side. And so the personal implication in the history of a conflict is to assume, well, people will say things that sit uncomfortably with me. Otherwise, there wouldn't be conflict. If we have no conflict, we agree. If there's a conflict, people will tell me something that I may not want to hear. And to at least consider that this other person's point has validity, is valued. Doesn't mean I have to adopt it, doesn't mean I have to agree with it, but at least create space for it as a valuable and valid experience. I think that is pretty much what one needs to do. Let me just tell you an experience that relates to all of this to some extent. When I came to the United States, this is how I started. You asked me about why am I here, why am I doing this? When I came to the United States and I moved through my studies and then beyond my studies at the university into communities where there were still Jewish survivors. Many of them are dead now, and then their children. And at this very moment, I was no longer Björn. In Germany, I was Björn. I was the German among Germans. I never thought of myself as German in Germany. I was just Björn in a culture that accepted me as Björn, as something special. In moving in Jewish circles in the 1980s in the United States, I was not Björn. I was, you probably can guess it, I was a German. They saw me as a German. And I thought, like, why are you seeing me as a German? I'm my own individual self with the name Björn. I never considered myself to be seen as a German. And that experience that some other people see you as something different than you are. I don't see you as Yusuf, I don't see you as Efe, I see you as, and I don't know where you're coming from, I see you as so-and-so. Is completely a very unsettling experience, but also a helpful experience. Some people have the experience and they shut down and say, I never want to talk to this person again or this community. But the opposite is to go with it. So like, if they see me as German, what exactly do they see in me that is German? And I suddenly realized, I make a lot of assumptions that can only come from my German history and my German education and my German parents that do not apply to my conversation partners who are Jewish and survivors or children of survivors or Palestinians. And so to say, okay, they see me as German because they see something in me that is actually different from them. And over time, they might see the complexity of who I am, not just the German. And that is the path forward. I see Yusuf as Yusuf and not as representing a community, and the community about which I have some images or prejudices or assumptions that may or may not be true. I actually learned, but I might first see you as something. Then I walked into a group in Jerusalem and then also in Bethlehem with Israelis and Palestinians. At first, I only saw them as Israelis and saw them as Palestinians. And everything they said was kind of trying to figure out, does this conform to my understanding of what Palestinians are and what they say, or Israelis are and what they say? And some of that matched and some of it was completely different. And only then was I willing to see people as individuals who happen to be Palestinians with their own experience or happen to be Israelis with their own experience. And vice versa. They saw me as someone who is not just German, but happened to be a German with a special approaches and special experiences and hopefully an openness to be in conversation.
Finally, we do a short closing segment. A personal question of sorts for our listeners' sake. Do you have a personal message or a story you'd like to leave with our listeners? Share your wisdom. Anything important?
5 years ago, I would have given you a different message than maybe now, because I was way more optimistic that we can learn from each other even in difficult circumstances. I'm a little less optimistic these days because people are not willing to talk to each other, are not willing to disagree openly with each other. That turns simply into fights. And politicians are not willing to find solutions. They go back to very primitive means of war and violence. So I'm a little less optimistic. And at the same time, I know that we still need to find places, spaces where these conversations can happen. Actually, I was asked yesterday by a group to what I think about how we can continue the work between Israelis and Palestinians, because they want to continue this work. And they said, they asked me what I think is much of the work we've done in the past was based on the assumption that we move towards coexistence, where we accept each other. This is no longer the case right now. So we need to change of what we think these meetings can accomplish. But I do think meetings are absolutely essential, even if we need to change the way we meet and what we think can be accomplished in these meetings. But I think meeting the other and talking, creating space for talking deeply, personally, critically, self-critically, remains important.
This marks the end of our podcast. We are very thankful, Professor Krondorfer, for taking the time, explaining and sharing your insights and wisdom with us. It was, I'm surprised how you took such a complicated topic and simplified it in a manner that everyone could understand. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.